All right, now we're there. Okay. So embryo adoption is a treatment that is really what it says on the tin. So the adoption of an embryo has been created. It's an embryo that has been created with the gametes of other people. So conceptually, it's very similar to adopting a child, but the person who does the treatment also has the full experience of carrying her pregnancy and delivering her baby. So the embryos come from healthy women under 35 years of age who after treatment no longer want to use any more of their embryos or have necessarily any more children. Furthermore, a large percentage of the embryos from egg and or sperm donations, they often come from egg and sperm donation cycles, and therefore they have a very good chance of implanting. The embryo adoption program was started in 2004 by the person whom you can see in the screen, Dr. Marisa Lopez-Tijon, and she started the program to give embryos a new chance of life. And from the beginning, it was a very, very popular treatment option. Many groups, and we'll go through who is particularly interested in this treatment, but many people from different groups, different profiles have enthusiastically requested this treatment. And so our center has one of the highest embryo adoption levels in the world, and more than 2,000 children have now been born thanks to this technique. And in the picture, you can see the 1,000th baby that was born. So this pioneering embryo adoption program at Institut Marquès is currently one of the biggest worldwide. The patients who decide to adopt an embryo only need travel to Barcelona for the embryo transfer itself. Everything else can be done in your own country. The embryos come from women, healthy women under 35 years of age, who are often also egg donors, and therefore the success rates are very high. You can see here that the positive pregnancy test rates are currently about 57% per embryo transfer, and the live birth rate is almost 40% per transfer. You can see also that the twin rate is very low because generally we would transfer just one day 5 embryo at the blastocyst stage, and we'll talk a little bit more about blastocysts in a minute. So for whom are the treatments indicated? The main thing is that we want to offer to women, we want to offer this treatment to women who are themselves in good physical and reproductive health. We accept women up to the age of 50 for this treatment, provided they are in good health, and sometimes we will ask your doctor to confirm that for us. Then within that group, we have smaller groups. So we have women without a male partner, so either single women or in female couples who wish to have a child, couples who have long-term infertility problems and unfortunately repeated failures and with their own gametes and would just like to try something different. We also have patients who've had recurrent miscarriages with their own gametes. And we sometimes have patients who are waiting to adopt a child who's already born, and they've not thought about having any fertility treatment for either religious or ethical beliefs, but they suddenly realize that there's this other option available to them. And I've got one other group. It's not very common, but I've had another family where they already had children of their own and they didn't want any more. They just wanted to adopt other embryos to expand their family so that the embryos weren't left in a laboratory, as it were. So the main thing to know about this treatment is that there's no waiting list. As soon as all the tests that we request have been completed and the preparatory treatment has started, then the transfer will take place normally 2 to 4 weeks after that. There's also, despite the name adoption, there is no formal adoption process. You just sign the consent form for treatment as if it was maybe an IVF treatment as well. So there's no official adoption process. So many people want to know how we would allocate the embryos. So first of all, the embryo is given to us. We then allocate it to a person of the same race as the original progenitors. So if you're Black, then the progenitors would have to be Black. And that's an understanding in Spanish law. It has to be that way. And this is a donation that is completely anonymous. So there is no possible link now or in the future between any child created and the original progenitors. To minimize the risk of two siblings meeting each other in the future, the system designed for embryo allocation ensures that the embryos are assigned to different countries or regions, and we make sure that happens. There'll be another slide about that in a minute. In preparation, we have to prepare the endometrium, so that's the inside of the uterus, to receive the embryo. And we do that before the embryo can be transferred. And we give medication to help with that. The medication we use would be estradiol, often in tablet form, but sometimes in patch form, and then vaginal pessaries of progesterone. Then, once you're ready for transfer, you'll have the embryo transfer. And before the transfer, the embryos are laid in a specific culture medium in the lab. And then we gather them into what we call a catheter, which is kind of like the inside of a biro, a bit like the inside of a biro. It's very long and thin and flexible. And the embryo just goes in there in a little dot of water. And then we pass the embryo up through the vagina, through the cervix, and deposit the embryo just at the entrance to the uterus. And this is done under ultrasound guidance with the woman completely awake, and she's watching on the screen the embryo that's being transferred and things like that. The process is very quick. It takes 5 to 10 minutes. It's not normally painful for anyone. And what we also check is once the process is finished, we take the catheter back to the lab to make sure the embryo is definitely gone. So it's not stuck in the tube or anything like that. Then we have to wait for 10 days or so to see what the pregnancy test shows. And in that time, in those 10 days, we hope the embryo will implant. The embryo is already 5 to 6 days old. 5 to 6 days old when it's transferred. That's the blastocyst. And, you know, as mentioned before, it has about a 50 to 60% chance of implanting. And then if you have a positive result, then you have to carry on with the medication that we initiated at the beginning of the cycle, the estradiol and progesterone, for about 56 days more. And during that time, you'll have ultrasound scans and checkups with your gynecologist in your own country to make sure you're fine with it and the pregnancy is evolving properly. You'll see here it says 70 days. It's 70 days from the day of transfer. It's 56 days from the day of the pregnancy test. All right. So here we've just got another slide for the embryo allocation system. So this is what they do in the lab to make sure that the embryos go all over the world. And so the last 500 cycles that we've done corresponded to women coming from 24 different countries. And I've got a list here I can read. So they came from Spain, not surprisingly, but also Italy, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Holland, Ireland, Belgium, Bulgaria, Sweden, Austria, Finland, Mexico, the USA, Australia, Algeria, Argentina, Guatemala, Canada, Russia, Albania, and Morocco. So spread out all over the world. And remember that for the embryo adoption program, you only need to come to Barcelona for the embryo transfer itself. So the donors, so who are the people that will be making these embryos? As I said, most of the embryos come from the donation program. So the female donors will be under 35 years of age. And we check the medical records of both parents, both the progenitors, and also the other children born from the IVF treatment. So the embryos we use are from patients who have successfully undergone fertility treatment and don't want any more children. The embryos that they have not wanted to use are frozen and they're preserved with us. And the people for whom these embryos were made can choose what they do with their leftover embryos. They can either give them to other people, or they can donate them to science, or they can destroy them. But if after 4 years they've not made any decision about what to do with their surplus embryos, then Spanish law allows us to take them and decide whether we want to put them into the embryo bank. So in these cases, as long as the original progenitors of the embryos meet all the necessary medical requirements, we can definitely put them into the embryo program. Okay, so we get some embryos that are directly donated to us and other embryos that are kind of abandoned, and they will then be vetted by the medical team and will make their way in, if they fulfill all the criteria, will then make their way into the donor embryo bank. So embryo adoption or embryo donation, these are two terms that we use quite interchangeably on our websites and things like that. But what does the law say? Essentially, when a woman creates embryos, this is just going over again what I've just mentioned, when a woman creates embryos, either with her own eggs or with donor eggs, then at the end of that process, if she has embryos left over that she doesn't want to use, she has 4 options for them. She can either keep them frozen for herself, or in case she changes her mind, she can donate them to other people, she can destroy them, or give them to research. And again, if she does none of these things for 3 to 4 years, then the embryos are considered abandoned and can be put forward for entry to the embryo adoption program. So the difference between embryo adoption and donation is purely a legal one. Some embryos come into our bank having been donated and others having been abandoned. But once inside the bank, we don't differentiate between how they were created. All right. So the next screen, how do the frozen embryos survive? So this is quite a nice kind of interesting part as well. So following fertility treatment, embryos that are not transferred to the uterus are preserved through a process called vitrification. Embryos can be frozen at different stages in their development, from the day they're fertilized, when they're just at a single cell, up to about 5 or 6 days later at the blastocyst stage, when they're made up of approximately 200 cells that will go on to make all the embryo's structures. There's no limit to the amount of time that the embryos can be frozen. So what do we do? They are, first of all, they're immersed in a cryoprotectant, so something to protect them against the freezing, and that stops ice crystals from forming. And then they're drawn, the embryos are drawn gently into white plastic straws or sticks, which are placed in a freezer that very quickly takes them down to minus 196 degrees centigrade. And the very drastic change in temperature converts the embryos into something similar to glass. And they then keep the embryos in their straws in the containers. And you can see a container there in the middle. In Institut Marquès, we decorate our containers as if it's kind of a nursery, and that's a mobile there for them. It's quite a laborious process. It's quick, but it's quite laborious, and you need really people who really know what they're doing when they're freezing them. But it's really changed the frozen embryo transfer rate and success rate to do the vitrification process, as now virtually all embryos survive the defrosting process. And when I started in fertility about 15 years ago, that definitely wasn't the case. So vitrification has been a very big change. Most embryos do survive the defrosting process very well. And the straws where the embryos are stored are all identified according to color and number, and so they can always be followed all the way through the laboratory and on the computers where everything is logged. So I mentioned a blastocyst, the roughly 200 cells, and so the blastocyst is what 90 to 95% of our transfers at Institut Marquès will be of a blastocyst embryo. So this is a day 5 or a day 6 embryo. And that allows us to select the embryos that didn't reach that stage are not used. It's just the ones that have the best chance of implantation. It allows us to synchronize the endometrium better with the stage of the embryo, and so thereby increasing the implantation rates. This technique is really indicated for all patients. We wouldn't really want to transfer embryos at earlier stages nowadays because we maximize the chances of success and minimize the chances of a multiple pregnancy. Some of you may know that we do genetic testing of embryos. We can do genetic testing of embryos. And I have to say that most of the embryos in the adoption program have not been genetically tested, principally because embryos created by women under the age of 35 have a very low risk of having genetic abnormalities. However, we do have a very small bank of embryos in our donor bank that have been genetically tested by means of something called next generation sequencing. So if you're interested in embryo adoption or embryo donation and you'd like a genetically tested embryo, then you can actually request that. And then let's see if I can play this video. Hopefully it will work. Here we go. Just to look at the center. This is the center. Okay. So you're well. So these are the blastocysts. Sorry, we thought you could hear the comments that are coming. Here are the transfer rooms. This is the lab, the laboratory areas, and the people who work in the laboratory areas. And here you can see patients. They can actually watch the technicians in the laboratory, the embryologists at work. So we show everything that we do for patients who want to see. This is an embryoscope. This is a very special incubator that we use for virtually all of our embryos now. It looks after them really well. and you can watch the embryos evolve in real time. And for patients doing egg donation, you can log on and watch your own embryos evolving. Yeah, más fuerte. Here you've got the process of actual embryo fertilization. This is ICSI. You can see the tiny little sperm being injected into the egg. And that's what the embryologists do each and every day for all of the eggs. And there's always music at Institut Marquès, everywhere, inside the laboratory, inside the incubators, inside the transfer rooms, there's music everywhere. And this is our embryo. We've got a project to plant a tree for all the children born from our treatments, a reforestation program. And so we've planted small trees that will be left to grow and have the name of the child beside them. The embryos are little patients as well, so we do concerts for the embryos, and it's real music that's played for them. And here you see the embryo evolving. So thank you very much for your attention.